Thank you for coming. Welcome to GPRC, the second session of the seminar series with Professor Sampath. Today we are discussing Heidegger. It's comparably difficult thinker, maybe even more difficult than Hegel. At least for me, it was because I don't have much background in Heidegger, but I think without further ado, I just want to give
Thank you, Matvey.
to the professor.
I appreciate coming back and seeing everyone again. I wish I had the time, but I know we all end at 5:30 to do a background presentation like I did with Hegel, but I think we're going to go right into the text. But the first question I do want to know is, have people read?
Jesus Christ.
Sorry, no worries. Have people read? I think that's the answer to my question. Have people read some Heidegger before? Not at all. Okay, this is good then. Then this gives me a chance to try, as we read the text. That's great, because I don't want you to think that you need to situate this in the entire work, his corpus, who is this person, a very problematic figure, which we can get into maybe in our conversation. But one of the analogies I like to use, whether we like it or not, it's unfortunate. In physics, Einstein's general relativity and Heisenberg's quantum mechanics are the twin revolutions that shaped everything in the field of physics up until the present. And Heisenberg was participating with the Nazis in trying to create the bomb. So whatever he did in the 20s with the quantum mechanics, Einstein's earlier course, Einstein's repudiation of that, and Einstein's suffering, someone of Jewish descent, from that period by having to leave. You can't imagine shaping the entire field of physics without those two revolutions. Similarly, some might argue that Heidegger in the 20th century for the continental European tradition, and maybe someone like Wittgenstein, the Anglo-American analytic tradition, a little earlier than Heidegger, his works, those, it's hard to imagine those two realms of philosophy without those two figures. So it's kind of unavoidable. Now, we're going to go into a space that I will probably fail at. It's a cop-out, but saying I'm going to fail in my ability to explain this without doing a fair amount of injustice to the work and what a lot of Heideggerian scholars might find problematic, because I'm either going too fast or I'm reducing certain things or conflating things, or I'm going to make the first fundamental error in most mainstream Heidegger scholarship. From the 60s and 70s onwards, this book is from 1927, the 100th year anniversary is coming up. So, France, Germany, World War II, Britain, America, and the global reception, which is now everywhere, the South, the East, that the fundamental assumption is that with Heidegger, we're talking about human beings. Very few people would dispute that. Some, like Derrida, when we get to him, will question the human-animal distinction. Why would the animal become subservient or less of a priority to Heidegger? And if you read the work, when he says this is the entity Dasein that we ourselves are, well, he's not a space alien, not a reindeer. He's a human being. So presumably, so are all we. But as a youngster, your age, maybe time is out of joint, and I feel like I really am with you in this time with your age, as your age, than I would have been myself in the early 90s, as a late teen, early 20-year-old, something. That I never assumed anything about the work relating to human beings. Like, imagine getting rid of the category of the human being altogether and then trying to read the work. And you can say, well, what are we talking about? Demigods, fiction, mythologies, some of the world religions, especially something like Christianity, which combines the divinity with the human being, or others that talk about a trans-sensorial, trans-bodily kind of enlightenment, if you want to really get into the depths of different branches of Buddhism, Sufi speculation, or maybe think of the Kabbalah. There are many ways to talk about things that are not necessarily human beings, but not other types of entities either that the dogmatic religions describe. So something sort of spiritual and metaphysical. So I'll have to say, no, we're not going to be talking about the religions or theologies. Some of you like literature and study literature, and that's certainly a realm that Heidegger has been brought into with tremendous influence, like we'll see with Derrida. But we're not going to have time to go into literature. So we're just going to have to go into the text and try to then understand these terms without any reference to human beings. And you're going to say, why are we doing this? What are we talking about? We're talking about death and finitude and anxiety and guilt and authenticity and what it means to live in the world and how inauthentic it is. That's what we talked about last time. The inauthenticity of the I being yanked out of you, even when it's you yourself doing it and trying to answer the question, then feeling bad about it. I remember Hobby was mentioning that. We all feel that way. Well, today we're going to feel that again, but from an entirely different way at the question. Not the master-slave dialectic, not the dialectic at all. And really, simply put, we're not talking about two entities like a self and another and the complexity of that relationship. Or the self-consciousness within one, the schism within one of those poles, which already exists in Hegel. And as I mentioned, wasn't part of a three-moment dialectic, but something else. So here, we're not going to be speaking about one or two or three, but at least four or five, maybe five, at least four. Let's see. Okay, being in time 1927. The earlier works begin in 1915 with what's called a Habilitationsschrift, actually earlier essays. It's a second dissertation in Germany, and then lectures, who then subsequently published into works. There was a lot that happened before this work. And this was written under pressure, just like Hegel's phenomenology with Jena, because Heidegger needed a job and failed to get previous jobs because he hadn't published a work, and that was part of his time in his system. And this was rushed, and what came out of it was this work, which he himself will admit was incomplete, and later would admit failed. And the project of fundamental ontology, but look at the contents. You'll see this intro. If I tried to explicate just the table of contents, we would need a whole semester, maybe a year, summarize the book. So I'm not even going to do that because I know I'll eat up all the time. I want to have fun with the section we're going to read together. And again, I'll try to give us about 30 minutes for discussion, conversation. I really want to hear from you. That for me is a fun part, not listening to myself speak. But the work has two divisions. Well, part one, sorry. You would think, okay, well, the work's going to have a part two. Why list a part one? Well, it only has a part one, and that's divided into these two divisions. Division one, fundamental analysis of Dasein. Well, first of all, the interpretation of Dasein in terms of temporality and the explication of time as the transcendental horizon for the question of being. Wow, listing time, temporality, and time twice. First of all, Dasein's linked to temporality, time's linked to a horizon, then you got being. But the definition of Dasein for you that study German, being there, some people think there being here, here being. And if the bracketing this Nazi question of Heidegger himself and the Nazi period, and what I before is the self-loathing inside that Gentile Nazi mindset, its utter inability to deal with the complexity of Hebrew and the Jewish tradition. But for many Gentiles who wouldn't be familiar with Hebrew, but the Yud Ha Vav Ha in the Hebrew Bible. I don't want to say Old Testament because what's so old about it? It's a separate entity. It's not the precursor to the New Testament Christian text. But this question of I am who I am, aming, this problem of to be as a temporal problem. That's from the Mosaic period, whenever that was written. That wasn't yesterday. It wasn't zero with Jesus. And it's older than the Buddha and the pre-Socratics. So I mean, if you follow the tradition, and that's what you want to go with. But in any case, there's an entwinement of being and time that is outside of Heidegger that he himself can't master. And other thinkers will critique Heidegger for that. That will come later. We'll get to people like Derrida, for example. In any case, this doubling effect here, Dasein temporality times horizon, part one. And then this first division, which most people spend their time at because it's where we get an understanding of what it means to be in the world for this entity that's being there being Dasein. The relation between Dasein and being in the world. Its basic state, as that chapter 2 says. I want to get into 3, but then he gets into space and time in the worldly sense, in the worlding sense, not space and time as a physical thing or an empirical thing. leave that for a second, but being in the world. We're going to be doing this chapter 4, and that's the first paragraph of the chapter, so we can't go through the whole thing. I'm just going to read that first paragraph and then quickly summarize the text for us, at least my interpretation. And I want you to challenge that and come up with your own interpretations. So that's where we're going to spend our time. Being in the world of being with, being oneself, the they, and then we'll end there today. Unfortunately, we can't continue onwards because for many folks, the entire work hinges on where it concludes in Division 1, care, Zorga, turns out to be the being of this really weird entity, not anxiety, not psychological anxiety about an exam or guilt or regret. It's not mourning. If you really want to take this strict ontological perspective on it, and the careful work that Heidegger does to distinguish that from all kind of human psychological registers of anxiety, its relationship to guilt, and finally truth itself as a type of disclosiveness, gets us to Division 2, and that's all there is in the work. There's nothing beyond Division 2. And that's where we really get, for some, the crux of the story, Dasein and temporality, starting with depth, resoluteness, what he calls ecstatic temporality. I'll talk a little bit about that. The everyday registers, that we can distinguish his version of temporality from all these other registers. Historicality, hugely important chapter, and also the problem of movement, Bewegung, as opposed to Bewegtheit, or Bewegtheit as opposed to Bewegung. And then this last chapter. But who does he end the work with? That's why we started with Hegel last week. Whose name do you see up there at the very end? Where does it all come crashing down? Our guy. Yeah. What's he doing there? And this work in 1927 is the history of everything from the pre-Socratics in the Western tradition, all the way up to Heidegger's time, past structuralist phenomenology, and the neo-Kantianism of his time, but also, quite frankly, the history of many religious traditions, at least in the medieval mystical Christian tradition, scholastic tradition, and then the Protestant theological context of his 20th century. So like I said, the blind spot or the inability or the repression or the trace that he can't even master, even know exists, is this Judaic structure that's way beyond him, admittedly. I don't have any biographical evidence of him studying Hebrew even as a Jesuit when he was in training before he left that, which today would be a requirement if you really wanted to study both Christian theology in a Catholic setting, to look at the quote unquote Old Testament in its original text. So he ends with Hegel and not anybody else. Everybody else appears in the story and is named in the text at some point or another, Plato and Aristotle, Kant, of course. But what's going on with the Hegel critique here? And then it ends. Now, before I jump to that chapter, I'll show you something really strange. I want to show you, after the introduction, which has 2 parts itself, the outline for what should have been a Division 3. Where do we get there? Oh, that actually is taking way too much time. It's 60 something. Let's scroll down. Okay, here we go. Okay, so part 1 has 3 divisions. He's talked about Division 1 being in the world Dasein, which will get into the who of Dasein today. Dasein and temporality, death being arguably the most important chapter there that a lot of people turn to, because he comes up with this really bizarre idea that distinguishing it from physical or biological perishing, individual or collective death, but existential death. Time and being, what's that Division 3? What does the footnote say? Sorry. Maybe it's the end note. So if you look at the end note I, sorry, 1 is the end note I, if you sort of scroll all the way to the end of the text, we'll say this division never appeared, and that's true. He wrote it. He gave it to his colleague and mentor of some sorts, Carl Jaspers, who read it and said, this is incomprehensible. So they tossed it. No one ever reconstructed it. People can imagine, maybe they're fragments and notes, and there's an enormously complex debate about this. I don't want to reduce it for the Heidegger school. We're not here to be Heidegger. I don't want to give it Heidegger. But needless to say, it doesn't exist. It's not here in front of us, so it doesn't exist. Maybe somewhere else, but it's not there in front of us, so it doesn't exist. So it didn't appear. And then part 2 doesn't appear. It does appear, what for many people say after being in time, are some really critical works in 1927, 28, 29 that follows. books on Kant, Leibniz, another essay on Aristotle in 1931, and quite frankly, Hegel again in 1931. But the first part, the second half I talked about. And then he takes a break. And then Nazism begins in 1933, as does his Nazism. Of course, there were precursors for that for him and others, but he then becomes the rector of a university, Freiburg, short-lived tenure, and then a history of what the historians today say was a commitment to the party till the end of the war, and went through the denazification process. So if he went through the denazification process, he was a Nazi till the end. Now, what happened afterwards is another issue. And then to bracket and not simplify, but we won't have the time, you should look it up on your own. But in 2014, there are several things in his death in 1976. He says you're gonna have to wait like decades to publish this, wait for a while before you release certain things. And these personal notebooks were released that document his thoughts and his writings and his ideas from 1933 and beyond for several decades. And for many who want to criticize Heidegger on the Nazi question, this is the smoking gun. Some want to defend him, some want to apologize, some want to separate the person from the life and the work from both. And, okay, yeah, he did this, but Heisenberg was building the bomb and da-da-da, you know, physicists are not going to throw out quantum mechanics. But we'll have to have another session on this. I can't reduce the complexity of the debates today. The smoking gun meaning there's enough there of explicit anti-Semitism to link Heidegger the person with Nazism for sure, and anti-Semitism. Then the question then becomes, does that invalidate the work as a whole? Do you throw out the baby with the bathwater? And he, quite frankly, has been sort of shut down in Germany. I don't know if anyone's been in Germany recently, but even the heads of the Heidegger research organizations, it's not an easy matter in continental Europe. You are studying continental Europe. The right wing is back everywhere. You saw what happened in Germany. But the scholarship on Heidegger in the academy, what does that mean in the Anglo-American context? Again, let's stay with the text. Happy to have another session where we really will unpack that and see how French thinkers have debated this issue. Very complicated matter. Derrida himself weighed in the 80s when the first book on Heidegger and Nazism came out by Victor Farias. Manuel Fay, very damning books about Heidegger, producing the evidence of, you know, the Nazism. Okay, let's go to the text itself, and I want to just dive right in. Define that first. Division in chapter 4, and I want to make sure our friends on Zoom can see the text.
All good.
Coming up, back on this. Where are you? Memorize this. Memorize page numbers. 78, 150. Okay. Here we go. Chapter 4, being in the world is being with and being oneself today. I think what would be helpful is if, as a reminder, as I do this interpretation, kind of contrast what we talked about with Hegel. Because maybe some of us are more familiar with the Hegel text since we went through it. And it's just, you know, we really got into it. I really enjoyed our discussion last time. I want to have that same sense today. But we're going to be coming at something in an entirely different way, as I said. And keep in mind the circularity of that formulation that I said about part 1. Dasein is temporality. So basically, we're going to learn that Dasein at its basis is being there, here being is rooted in something called temporality. And just to, right off the bat, you're going to have to block. We're not talking about linear time, seconds and minutes. We're not talking about chronological historical time. So the good news is let's pretend we're not living in the Trump age as Gen Z. Just fantasize that you're living in, that's like a nightmare that will go away and you're living in another reality. Historical time, decades, centuries, millennia, the historicity of that historical time, you know. Physicists, you know, they love to confound themselves in their paradoxes. Oh, 13 billion years old. And yet they're the same people with relativity saying, hey, time can dilate. depending on relative frames and what's moving, and the speed of light, it can move faster or slower. So how the hell are you going to agree to one age frame? Why are you using the Earth as the $13 billion year frame to talk about the age of the universe in some linear way? You yourself said, hey, time could be this or that. They only have three, past, present, future, attached to space, which also has three, depth, height, length. Then they get their four-dimensional space-time. And they do all kinds of funny stuff in there. The black holes and the wormholes and their science fiction. Let's leave them aside. Those guys only have three, so stay with your three. Have at it. We're not talking about any of those registers of time. Lastly, which when we get to quote unquote our applications, the temporality of transitivity. You don't agree with your gender assigned at your birth, the temporalization of transition, the question of the origin, we'll definitely get into that. There we go. Are you 20, I don't know, 21, 20, or are you not? According to somebody, but do you have to be that? Could we be something else? Is that derived from something else, something deeper? What the heck are we talking about? How can that be derived from something deeper, a type of temporalization? So that, and therefore time will become this horizon for understanding, is giving us already at the very beginning of the table of contents what appears to be a circularity. Dasein rooted in temporality, it's not limited time, time is a horizon for understanding, being Dasein possesses this unique ability to understand. But in this division one, we learned that Dasein's fundamental state is being. Our analysis of the worldhood of the world. Worldhood of the world, what's that? Remember we said, you can't drink or do drugs to do Hegel? Perhaps someone might want to venture that. I'm not going to do it, but if you want to try to do that, maybe this language will become more clear to you. But in the English translation, let alone the German, this reads like it reads. So people will say, what is this? What's the repetition of the terms here? Our analysis of the world has constantly been bringing the whole phenomenon of being in the world into view. Although its constituent items have not all stood out with the same phenomenal distinctness as the phenomenon of the world itself. Now, don't think the world is the cosmos, the earth, a metaphor, physical geology, being in space-time, and a priori of space-time, it's consciousness. It's not of the empirical sense, it's never an object of our senses, but it allows us to furnish through the categories representations of the outside world because of our intuition of space and time, to then give us some access through our experience of things without ever getting to the thing itself. So that's your Kant. But it's not space and time like the physicists. We're right here. It's invisible, time's ticking away, they're related, etc. So what the heck is the world? Being in the world. We have interpreted the world ontologically. It's another important term here. When we say ontological and fundamental ontology, I want you to think of that, as he says, not ontically, as physical entities or beings. Perhaps you think we're physical entities or beings. We're spiritual beings, metaphorical beings, things, entities. Fundamental ontology, the question of the meaning of being. But as he says in that very first paragraph, it's also the meaning of the question. What the hell does that question mean to you? Question of the meaning of being. Okay, wow, what does being mean? What is? Is can't be is. It's not necessarily is not past or used to be or yet to be future is also not yet. So negation, identity, a simplified Hegel, not my Hegel, but Heidegger's straw man Hegel that he has to criticize. So it's not a being, it's the meaning of being, but what's this meaning part? And then what's the meaning of that question? And who's posing it? If it's not a human being, you're not going to get it from religion or politicians or your parents. And yet it's us extended statically, thrown in the world, having to be in the world, maybe in the world, but not of it, but not a thing in the world. Ontological. We have interpreted ontologically. And this interpretation has been put first because Dasein in its everydayness, with regard to which Dasein remains a constant theme for study, constant, ständig. That's also a feature of Dasein. You might say constant, like unchanging, and time is about change, right? But we're changing, transitioning, transformation. he doesn't mean constant in the sense of impermanence, but permanence or impermanence, but unrelenting. That's got to stay in the forefront. Even though it's this pre-disclosure that has to take place before we even get to any kind of understanding of anything. Not only is in the world, but comports itself towards that world with one predominant kind of being. Approximately, and for the most part, Dasein is fascinated with its world. Dasein is thus absorbed in it. The kind of being which it thus possesses, and in general, the being in which underlies it, are essential in determining the character of a phenomenon we're now about to study. A couple more distinctions before I finish this last part of the paragraph. That distinction between linear time and something else, more primordial. Without having we had the time, we'd read that section on ecstatic temporalities. But one simple example, if you're just going to turn to phenomenology, and Heidegger is not just doing some kind of phenomenology, he's actually critical of that too. Meaning his predecessor who introduced this thing called phenomenology, Husserl. That if you just take we human beings, I'm trying to think of some examples. So forget about physical time, like we talked about, and human time, but just within us, human beings. Now, if you're young, maybe time is relative. Your high school years might have been very slow and horrible. You're like, I can't wait to get the hell out of here. That's how I felt. Actually felt that about college too, at Berkeley. So I did it fast. I want to get the hell out of there, not because I'm smart or I'm driven. It's just like, you just are miserable. Time is passing for you. Not that linear time and not your age, but it's just taken forever. I mean, that's how I felt. And here I am temporalizing that because I was saying was when I was 20, 17 to 20. And now it seems to be flying by that I'm in this really ontic space of being married and having kids. And the day to day. So the days may last forever, but it's just, we're halfway through the 2020s. You just finished the 2010s. You're barely adults if 18 is adulthood, right? You're not 100 years old, you're not 50 years old, you're not 4 years old. So what the distinction of time between different groups of people is a serious matter. You can say, well, no, that's just subjective, experiential, because we're all slaves to that. We all have to be mindful of that. We're everything, Marx will tell us, hey, that because of that thing, which is the perfect weapon for capitalism, is what conceals the surplus labor value that the capitalist extracts from the worker, accrues the profit, and works the worker to death, and has no regard for the ability of the worker to survive and subsist. So it's the perfect tool for domination. We're not using that. We're going to have to dispossess ourselves of that. You're also going to have to get rid of the line of saying, hey, your past is back there behind you, 0, birth, 2018, 19, 20, 21, 22. A few years will be in your mid-20s. 2028 will have another presidential election. So it's not that future, it's not that past. And here's the hard part. The present, which seems to be the priority. There's nothing more present than right now. We're going to get into that next week. So Derrida. Self-present, I can hear speech. That's prior. I'm hearing myself, you can hear me, we're simultaneous. It's not like reading a text where there's some kind of delay, like, oh, wait a minute. Somebody wrote that a long time ago. I'm reading it, I'm interpreting it. It's speaking to me. Is that something ghostly? Am I bringing something into the text? What's the temporality of that? We're going to get into those issues. Derrida is going to upend all those assumptions. It's common assumptions with speech and writing. But you think we're present right now. And what's not present is the past and the future. The no longer and the not yet. Get rid of all three of those. What the hell else are we going to be left with? Are you really saying that don't believe we're here right now? Parallel universes notwithstanding in physics? Are you here right now? Or is an older self no longer here that has transitioned or transformed into someone else? Who owns the present? But we can't become enslaved to the present either. That's what's going to make this section very difficult to unpack. So everydayness may look like, hey, everyday flowing of time, look, people are walking, you got to finish up, go to class, I got to do this tonight, every day. Trump spoke last night, this is going on. There's nothing more fundamental than being in the world. The facticity of that is indisputable, not because it's going to reinscribe the subject-object distinction and give Heidegger any kind of certitude. He doesn't believe in that stuff. There's no subject, object, predicate relation to get to this, some kind of certified. He cares about disclosiveness. And what he talks about is a clearing, and even within being time, before you get to the later Heidegger, clearing that has to take place for us to be there in order to be able to receive propositions of truth and logic. You got to be there first. You're here now before you even understand something, right? And here we are trying to share and understand together. Something else is happening. He wants to get to that level of the event of what's happening. So in fact, the worldhood of the world and everydayness has this event-like quality. And we have to like resist the temptation of locating that back in space and time, like this linear time that's flowing. All right, all the structures of being which belong to Dasein. Oh, sorry. It's fascinating. Dasein is thus absorbed in the world and the kind of being which it thus possesses. In general, the being in which underlies it are essential in determining the character of the phenomena which we're now about to study. We shall approach this phenomenon by asking who it is that Dasein is in its everydayness. All the structures of being which belong to Dasein, together with the phenomenon which provides the answer to the question of the who, are ways of its being. Structures of being are ways of being, together with the phenomenon, may give us an answer to this question of who. Who are you? I'm so-and-so. We talked about that last time. Right? I dare someone to reduce poor Hegel, the great Hegel, to the who of his work. Oh, it's spirit. Oh, it's the notion. Oh, it's the Trinitarian Christian God. Oh, it's the dialectical synthesis. Oh, it's philosophy of history. Oh, it's the state realizes freedom, even though he's a fascist totalitarian who believes in the absolute nature of the state. It's this, that. Sorry, I know we brought this up. It's social recognition, sociality. Kojève and others will help us to reconstruct the herd. We don't need to simplify the interpretations of Hegel with those other types of conflations. But Heidegger, you're not going to get any of this, at least in this moment. Answers to this who. What are you going to get? We must therefore pose to characterize these ontologically, the ways, the structures of being, the answer to the question of who. To do that ontologically is to do so extensionally. We must therefore pose the question correctly and outline the procedure for bringing into view a broader phenomenal domain of Dasein's everydayness. By directing our researches towards the phenomenon, which is to provide us with an answer to the question who, we should be led to certain structures of Dasein, which are equiprimordial, Gleichsprünglichkeit, with being in the world. So what are these structures? What is this equiprimordiality? Much later on in division 2, when he gets to not past, present, and future, not a sequence of now points moving along, present becoming past no longer now, future arriving, yet to be now is now and now present, or you can say present moving into the future, and therefore creating an older present that becomes a past, and this new future comes along, becomes present. That's a common sense, what he calls vulgar, inauthentic, everyday notion that we're all trapped in. He wants to get to something deeper. Not going to get into those deep structures, but there too he mentions an equiprimordiality, what he calls the ecstasies, the witherings of futures that kind of coming towards, but not something arriving from the future. And past is not something behind us like our birth, but a having beenness that lingers. And the present is something that's fashioned out of those two. And they have some very strange set of relationships, all three of those things, and an equiprimordiality, and which each of those three define its relationship to the other two differently. Whereas for this linear scheme of time, past, present, future, you can align them in a billion different ways. We do that in our internal consciousness, or unconsciousness, that our dreams. I mentioned that distinction between being a young person where time goes by slowly, becoming older and just flying by, senses of mortality and finitude. Those are anthropological, cultural constructions of time, so vastly different. You can tell me more about technology and how that might be either speeding things up or fragmenting time. I think we had a comment last week about the instant and how we live out time. Well, right here, let's contrast it already with some earlier Heidegger, which we're not going to get into, but in the early 20s, in his Phenomenology of Religious Life lectures, he dove into the New Testament and Paul. So if you're not familiar with Christianity, don't worry about it. but it's not the gospel about the life of Jesus, the four gospels. It's about Paul, the once prosecutor of the early Christians, then converted, but never a witness to the living Jesus, who wrote most of the text about this testimony of the resurrected Lord, the Christian God at the center of Christianity. And so Heidegger is busy in that for some reason, commenting on those sections. And his hypothesis is that there's something about Paul, this weird dude, who never saw the living Jesus, wasn't there at the cross, and no one saw the resurrection, it was a sealed tomb. He comes out, talks to his friends, and then heads up to the Father, and that's what they saw. He didn't see any of that, but he saw something, and he's trying to like describe it. And Heidegger says, well, it seems to me that kind of awaiting for a second coming that Paul postulated, whatever those early Christians were, not the current Pope or whatever you think Christianity is today, and the history of it, but way back then, so close to the events in the beginning, is lived temporality. Christian religiosity is lived temporality. It's not linear time. Something else is going on. I said, wait a minute, Heidegger, did you take that did you steal that from not from the Bible or from Christianity as you're trying to formulate this? Nope. It says that very early on. But theology too, as transcendental as it is, you're talking about something like God, that too is some ridiculous ontic entity that's in the world. That's too simple for me. All right, well, maybe that brings Heidegger into a very interesting conversation with Marx, Freud, many other people that you're all fascinated with in the 20th century. So we can't turn there. In 24, he's got a little pamphlet called The Concept of Time, again, given to a group of theologians. He's also reading the New Testament theology at the time in Marburg, in the Greek, a very famous theologian of its time, of that time, Bultmann. And there he's wondering, like, metaphysics asks, what is time? Aristotle's physics. Kant gets into it. He's going to go after Hegel eventually. Hegel struggles with it, spirit and time's relationship. The notion into time, that final Aufheben, religion into philosophy. So he goes, I don't want to ask what is time as if it's a metaphysical question. I don't care about metaphysics. I'm trying to destroy that. That's what everybody else did. Even Nietzsche, he's the last one. The eternal return. Just one fancy way of upending everything, but it's still a metaphysical idea, and I don't want to do metaphysics. Because that's for human beings that want to go beyond themselves. We can't do that. We're limited. We're finite. So, but he says a more interesting question would be, who is time? Not what is time. Who? But Dasein, who's Dasein? And Dasein's rooted in temporality, but temporality is ecstatic. It's got these weird interrelationships. What's going on here? So who is time? Again, so we want to contrast Being in Time as a weird book and moment in philosophy, because it's not like any other previous philosophy, and it's not religion, he said that, or theology. It's not anthropology, and the social sciences or psychology. But it has an eerie resemblance to religion in the New Testament. The Jesus quotes I mentioned from last week. Who is it they say I am? My time has not yet come. This is the time for which I was sent. Some strange discourses where he's not talking to people, either the disciples, he's talking to his quote unquote father, about a type of pre-existent relationality. John 17, if you turn to that, it's before his arrest. Don't worry about the death and the resurrection. That's all religion and myth and whatnot. What's this dude talking about? Time has not yet come. Who's it they say I am? In the world, but not of it. Give me the existence I had before the foundation of the world. I'm no longer in the world. I want to get into the Greek complexity. I have to rely on my friends in Greek to tell me about the aorist tense, aorist from the Greek tense structure, which doesn't exist. You tell me about the languages you know, where we can find different registers of temporality. But are we talking about hypothetically running the marathon? But imagine being in a hot air balloon where you're so high up, you can see the person from the beginning running and whoever's finishing the Boston Marathon. It's one vantage point while you're seeing it all occur. And yet it seems to be bounded and finite because the marathon has to have a beginning and an end. Now imagine doing that to your life. Are we talking about that? Are we talking about the contingency of our lives? Some analogies could be, hey, when you're born, you're like a bucket and you're given a certain amount of water. The water is time. and someone pokes a hole in it. You're Plato. Philosophy is just one big preparation for death. You're dying from the time you're born, which is true. But the bucket can spill over, it can shatter, bad things can happen. The hole's bigger for whatever reason. It gets bigger, you lose more of it. He's concerned also with, it's not his analogy, it's mine. It's a way to try to explain what he's talking about. It's like, how are we using up our time? Boredom. Nobody likes waiting for the train. Even if you have your cell phone, you got something to do. Perhaps you're with your friend and you can just at least chat and forget like it's so miserable. And it's late. Anyway. Or maybe right now it's occurring. Like, when is this professor going to shut up? Let's get to the discussion. But the point is that that is an interlinking of not necessarily being present to the time that's flowing, but having an anxiety about something not occurring. And yet it's also this feeling of delay and postponement, and therefore something should have happened. Take yourself out of that inauthentic moment, or maybe very authentic moment, and turn that into everything. This is the train station right now. Or maybe you like my class or my presentations, but think of something that you didn't. We're not looking at. Or why can't this occur? So it's this relationality we have to get to that has an ecstatic structure. The who. So coming back to the who is it? It's not the religious structures, but it's not anthropological. Well, what do we have here? We've got about 10 more minutes. We can wrap it up. By directing our researchers towards finding which provides for an answer to the question who, we should be led to certain structures of Dasein, which are equiprimordial with being in the world. Being with, mit sein, Dasein with, mit Dasein. Does that mean other Daseins? But then, Raj, you just said Dasein is not about the individual self or ego, vis-a-vis the other. Obvious Dasein. So we're not talking about a pluralism, collective of peoples and individuals. What does that mean for the proletariat? Lukács, I'm thinking. There are not many others, of course, but still. There's just the massive Marxian question about identity and subjectivity of the proletariat. That came up last time with the Koji. So let's be careful here about the sociality. I mean, he does use some words earlier on where he's talking about the welfare state and a kind of solidarity, national socialism notwithstanding, which is what he will turn out to be, but in this text, we'll be careful about this. But being with, time as a horizon for understanding being. The question of being is built into Dasein. Dasein has this unique capacity to answer and pose this question. Will he get it? Will it get an answer? We don't know. Time's a horizon for understanding it. Understanding of being and being in the world, equiprimordial. Look at all these structures. Understanding, not understanding like I understand Trump's speech or understand that math class. Wow, I really understand where Brandeis is going. Not those ontic understandings. I'm not talking about that. Are we talking about understanding about being in the world? What does that mean to you individually? No, this is not solipsism, skepticism. It's not relativism. It's got to have a universal structure. That's empty, according to Heidegger. Everybody else asks what is being ontologically and then try to come up with answers. That's metaphysics. Hey, being is this, it's that. He's like, no, I'm going to destroy all that and kind of put the question back together again. Some people accuse him of saying he tried to take apart the watch, which is the question of being in the history of metaphysics. By the time he put back the question together, he made it so complicated he couldn't solve it himself. To the point where the damn thing doesn't work. But we have these structures. Here's a good candidate. In this kind of being is grounded the mode of everyday being oneself. Last week, forget about the self-other. It's the self-other inside the self. Consciousness, conscious of self. Master slavery inside yourself. That first impetus of desire, I felt really bad when we finished last week because I found all these young people. Maybe you do want to be something or become something, and that's what you're supposed to do at your age. And I'm telling you, give up. Don't answer the question. Maybe redo the party. Let's get serious about this. Totally eviscerate your identity. Now, but what does that mean for intersectionality? And rights, and justice. All right, I'm not into being oneself, so that doesn't mean anything. His problem, and many people say, the application of this mode, I'll stop here for the reading, will enable us to see what we may call the subject of everydayness, the they, das Man. Let me go back to this footnote. I don't know if our friends on Zoom can see this, but can you read that back there? No, it's too small. How about that? A little bit better. Das Man. In German, one may write man glaubt. The others, Rosemary, you tell me you were doing some training. So glauben, to believe, right? One believes. Where in French, one would en croire, or in English, they believe. Well, man, I guess. Or one believes, yeah. They believe, one believes, it is believed. It's just out there. Public discourse, fake news, propaganda, science, religion. Anyone when the collective has to think or discourse or live in language and play a game with truth, play games like Wittgenstein. But the German man, the French on are specialized for such constructions in a way in which the pronouns they, one, and it are not. Hey, how about the irreducibility of non-binary? I'm not just trying to legalize a third gender here, like some post-colonial global South countries. We don't talk about the third. That's an insult. How about just deconstructing the concept of the they, but also not denying its existence, which is what they're trying to do right now by erasing everything and restoring the binary. Trump said it in his speech. Tell me about the they, not the one and the many, or the plurality, or the dysphoria, or the transition, or the origin that was false, or the correction, or the new identity, the Hegel problem, the Heidegger problem. Heidegger will come out differently. But my mind is going in that direction. I want us to have this other ontology of the they, or as a justification for trans rights. There is accordingly no single idiomatic translation from the German man, which will not sometimes lend itself in ambiguity. We have chosen whichever construction seems the most appropriate in its context, but when Heidegger introduces this word with a definite article and writes das Man, and he does this very often in this chapter, we shall translate this expression as the they, trusting that the reader will not take this too literally. I'd like to take it very literally. So the they, that sounds so funny. They, old people, which we're all inherently mistrustful of, which would include me because I'm part of the old people. The they, those they, what the hell do they know about anything? They don't know anything. I really don't think they know. Certainly, if you looked at the speeches, no people. Our chapter on the who of the average dinosaur will thus be divided up. And he recapitulates those 4 sections. So let's just keep the they. And so by way of summary, what do we want to say here? I don't want to reduce the chapter. I mean, a lot of figures have spent, remember during my days, Derrida would always come back to this chapter. And there's public lectures, which could go on for 6 hours, and just dwell on this. I did want to contrast it with the religious, as mysterious as it could be. That weird lecture in 1924, who is time, not what is time? What do you mean, who is time? But then there's a subject of everydayness. Transpiration, we're slaves to that linear time. You all celebrate New Year's? Trust me, when you get older, you're not going to want to do that. You're going to be like, why are you celebrating 1 year closer to your own demise? Or the world's demise? Like, the hell is Anderson Cooper doing? Ridiculous. What's happening here? What is this das Man and this commodity fetish of the New Year? So we want to, it's a project for freedom and self-determination to overcome linear time. It's in your interest to maybe engage in that project of overcoming it. Then how can it be finite? It's Kierkegaard. Is it a distortion? Is he asked of sickness unto death? In the self-infinite relationship, when the finite really has to be truly finite, you can't even have a finite conception of your relationship between the finite and the absolute. It's not simple notions of guilt because you're going to die and you're going to feel guilty for not having lived a life a certain way, or some religious notion of being judged or an afterlife, but some other distortion is taking place in your own finitude. Otherwise, you wouldn't feel bad about having a finite amount of time. And what the hell else are you going to have? Because you can't prove an infinite amount of time. What about the animals? Although we'll come back to the animal Derrida, but let's say that for this hierarchy of the human over the animal, what are they worried about? Marx's line, worried about his species being alienated from his labor and his essence at the moment of death? Or Hegel for that matter. So we have to be careful. We're not going to answer this here. Therefore, you're not going to know what dogma is. Being with in community, religious, civil, national, gendered. Some of us are categorized racially. It's not being with in groups. With other Daseins is not other minds. Like we're all kind of like going through this. We're in the world. We're gonna die. We don't know when it's gonna happen. It's the most certain thing, as he says. It's non-relational. I can't take your place. I can push you out of the way if the bus is coming, but you're still gonna have to die your death. You'll live for that moment. I'll get hit. So I can't take the place. Eternal life. I believe Jesus died, was resurrected. Therefore, I'll have eternal life. That's not gonna be an option. Buddhistic death, nirvana. Wow, that'd be really cool if you experience death as the transcendence of the body while you're still alive in a super state of consciousness. That would be awesome. I wish we could try that. No, sorry, I can't. That's, you know. Demising terminal cases, debates about physician-assisted dying, dying with dignity, choosing the moment of your death, the nature of the flat one, brain death, withdrawal of life systems, the event of actual death induced, seeing the other dying, Platonic or Aristotelian problems with rest and motion, just watching something stopping, that's not death. Or in motion, that's life. No. Yeah, you might see some registers like that, but don't reduce Plato and Aristotle. They'll complicate this. So we can't turn to the metaphysics of movement and life. Wow, we're really being, it's impossible to get at things. How are we going to understand the relation between time and being as an event? And this non-relationality and this singularity. He calls it a radical individuation. He doesn't mean being an individual or being unique, but you're so individuated that you can't cling to any kind of concept or definition that you might go insane. That instant. We were talking about that last week. All right, this oneself, by the time you get to that, you know, in the next paragraph, it's this uncanniness because at the end of the day, you go home and you, what was that song I just heard? You wake up, Billy Joel, maybe it was, you got to go to sleep and you wake up with yourself. You can't wake up with somebody else. You're alone. With somebody else and you wake up with somebody or a pet, but you got to wake up with yourself. Or you're going to leave this room or this body and you went to the party. We'll use your example, Avi. You weren't yourself. You had to go talk about yourself. Then you were upset with yourself because that was, in your mind, disingenuous. We've all been there. And then you just feel sick. You feel nauseous. Then you're mad, but you've already done it. Drunk or not. And many people have the drunken guilt later when we do something. They act like an ass or something because they got too drunk. Not that. Just like imagine the sober version of that nausea.
I was dead sober.
You were dead sober. I mean, we're so like that's what it is. But so you can be so alone in the crowd, talking away, Dasein and the Derrida, the chatter, the empty talk. Or, as you said, the multiplicitous richness in being alone did not come out. Anyway, being oneself is not going to help either. The Kantian apperception of the unity of the I, to use technical language accompanying all my representations, the self-time relationship. I mean, let's think about it. All the psychological registers that descend on us. You want to interpret a dream. The dream is prophetic. The dream repeats a trauma from the past, a childhood trauma. You have those dreams that something happened to you in the past. It's all about temporality, right? deja vu, those weird moments like, oh, I've done this before. No, this is the first time I've experienced your thinking. But then why would I unlock something that was forgotten if it's brand new, or that doubling sense of this occurring if it never occurred, that kind of shit. We're always you're always embellishing in this thing called the self in relationship. Selfish. Got to guard my time. No way, I don't want to do this. When you're kids, you're not kids, when you were kids, you're under control, you're custodians or some house you're living in. You didn't control your time. Now you do. So, but why do you become so guarded about the time? Or how about the boredom at the train station? So this thing, it's going to turn out to be, as I will just quickly fast forward here. Let's read this. The assertion that it is I who in each case Dasein is, hey, that seems obvious. The I, the Parmenidean I, thought partaking of being in some kind of unity. You're going to fill that thing up? Like an autobiography would be torture, not because you have to recount all the terrible moments of your life, but take me, some old person, which is not going to be around forever. It's not the accumulation of events or Nietzsche's eternal return, all the mysteries around that. What if, is it someone's got a video on me, now you can do videos of young people with your phones and just take a video of your whole life. Privacy issues notwithstanding. And is it distending one instant eternally? If I do that, how am I going to jump to the next moment? Graduate from high school, go to college, graduate from college. Is it trying to rewind all the moments in one instant and play that eternally? Is it the simple idea of just rewinding the tape and watching the same movie over and over again, beginning to end? No. To give Nietzsche his due complexity, it's a mystery, but it certainly is not just the willing of this one self for eternity, even though you can only live it once. It's not something genealogical or Christological, but this pre-existence, this actual death, this co-temporal eternal structure, the one-time occurrence, yet it's universal, eternal, finite and singular because it's a real death, but not, so it's not theology. Needless to say, other philosophers are not going to help us, whether it's Nietzsche or Kierkegaard or others, on this being oneself in relationship to time. The assertion of I, but this must not lead us into supposing that the route for an ontological interpretation, question of the meaning of being, the meaning of the question, the specific rootedness of Dasein as being there in that question. It's open. At the very end, division 2 is going to say, hey, this is just one path. It's in the forest. I'm clearing things out. Maybe somebody else can do it in another way, but I certainly don't have the answer. If you go to the very last sentence, is a question. At the very end of the text, is time the horizon for, have I gotten from being to time? Is time the horizon for being? He ends the text with a question. But indeed, it remains questionable whether even the mere ontical content of the above assertion does proper justice to the stock phenomena belonging to everyday Dasein. It could be that the who of everyday Dasein just is not the I myself. So how do we summarize here? It's very hard. We have no choice, to turn to autobiography, psychology, memory, our dreams, the things you care about the most. You want to talk about care, Zorga? Presumably you care about your friends, your family, your loved ones. Care about things. That's all intratemporal. Someone told you had a birth. You're living right now. You're not dead. The now is now. It's not yesterday. And then hopefully tomorrow, as Hume asked, how do you know the sun can rise every day? You just want to believe that. No causal effect between the belief and the thing occurring. Yeah, the sun's going to rise tomorrow. Maybe. So it's almost indissociable with the self and time. And yet we have to get to something deeper. So the death would have to be not the guilt of being a certain age and not fulfilling something, or unfulfilled ambition. Milton say about Satan in Paradise Lost. Nothing worse than injured pride. He gambled. Satan thought he could take the place of God. He fell, dragged a bunch of other demons with angels who became demons. And they're like, what the hell did you go do, Satan? He's like, shut up and let me think. gotta keep going here. It's not this sense of, it's not that type of guilt and conscience. It's wanting to be called out for something beyond the present age, knowing that you will die, but you don't do it in a selfish, narcissistic way. Maybe this gets us to the slave encountering death and master slave for Hegel. And some analogies that I tend to use when I teach is like, some people might want to think of the terminal patient, or they might want to think about on the death question. Think about, or if they're a faith person, they might believe in the afterlife. Or maybe we hear about these near-death experiences, about seeing the light and approaching things, and coming back, and okay, I see my body and walk, and unconditional love, or whiteness. White? Why is it always white? Gets racialized in a very weird way. Those are all these kind of ordinary registers of death that has to plot the living in the present and the dead in the future, and also the past. By that I mean, you might want to fantasize for those where physician-assisted dying is legal. And there are debates about this in Canada. Here in America, especially the Republicans and the conservatives, are aghast at this. They hate it. They hate that idea. But teenagers in Belgium can get it for whatever reasons. I think the Dutch too, like for mental illnesses. If something is just an incurable form of mental illness. You're talking about the types that's so debilitating that why it's tantamount to daily torture. Or the inverse analogy. For us, we're breathing, right? We need to breathe in oxygen. But what if you're drowning? Or what if life is drowning for some people? And the inverse is what they would call the solution. Death is living. Or if Foucault talks about in the History of Madness, the patient who thought he was dead and therefore said, I'm not going to eat. And the doctors are all scrambling like, oh my God, he's going to die. He's starving to death. But he really was happy. And so they faked him out by taking him into a room, showing a bunch of dead people eating a big turkey dinner. So it's that, like, what are we, you want to evacuate any kind of sense of guilt linked to linear time, but there's this accumulation of a sense of dread that maybe when it's all over, not because you want to live to see your funeral, you could somehow be present and imagine in your mind as you're heading towards death. That's why I thought the physician-assisted dying, of what people will plan for you at that moment of death. The songs they're going to play, how they're going to remember you, what stories you're going to tell. Maybe you can pretend you can be there like a ghost and say, oh, wow, you can see some people crying, they're happy, they're celebrating. But that's still a spatialization of the future from the standpoint of the present. That's an agglomeration of life and death, some strange event. It's also something that's of representation. And in continental philosophy, this is what we want to study. We don't simply represent our questions as such. It's definitely when we get to some understanding. So we have to conclude that, okay, we don't have it's I, myself. Being with presupposes what the being is, but we don't have an answer to that. Dasein, we simply said, was being there, and the whole book, Being in Time, doesn't even get to being. It's about this Dasein analytic to set up the question of fundamental ontology. We haven't gotten to the remaining chapters, I wish we could, on ecstatic temporality, but I will conclude there. I'm already past 4. But in ecstatic temporality, section 65, he says that coming towards my having beenness and making present as one formulation. Ecstatic in and for itself, but completely outside of itself. Coming towards is impending, not me coming to the door of something arriving, which you think death could be. Past, whether you want to imagine that funeral, you're already no longer in the world and someone else is remembering you, or you remember when you were 10 and you did something in school or whatever. So it's not that either. And as we said, you have to suspend the present. It's not right now. So the coming towards and up against and impending, the slave to death maybe, alienation, whatever. Having beenness, hey, that's something you can be proud of as if it's really present, not when you were 8. And the present can't be anything with these other registers because they're all inauthentic, especially this thing called the they. So to start our discussion, I'd like to know, forget about all these technical, who's the they for you? And you may, if for Heidegger and Heideggerians, the days don't think it's something bad, it's constitutive. You can't escape it. You can be a monk sitting there by yourself in your solitary cell, like an Augustinian monk. That dude's not alone. He's with the they too. That's what Heidegger would say. Don't make it physical. It's not like being alone or in your head or taking a vow of silence for 3 months. That's not it. It's not you. That's what that last line says. It's not, I myself, you can't start with that or end with that with regard to all these other registers. So let's stop here. Let's open it up. I'd like to know, first of all, general reactions, if you're hearing some of the stuff for the first time. And then if people feel like the they is the quintessence of inauthenticity, the disgust of the party, coming back from the party, how are you supposed to live? So there's your ethics philosophy question for the day. How do you want to live? How are you going to live?
And for the people on Zoom, raise your hand and we'll call.
Yes, please. I'm sorry if we.
Yeah, or write the question as somebody already did. We'll address it at some point.
Great. Who would like to throw themselves into a lot to take up? What's that?
Is it Geworfenheit?
There's your
Yeah,
Geworfen, there's your
yeah,
thrownness, your thrown like a boomerang. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. Because what are we supposed to do with the eye, like we talked about last time? Yes, Rosemary.
Well, I guess the question that the whole because I felt the most taken by the last passage on the they. Frankly, there was, I mean, a large part of, I mean, the whole text that I didn't really, it didn't all land for me, just in the sense of like immediate understanding even. But I think I maybe was most like engaged when I was reading the last passage. And I guess there's this question that I'm curious about as to like whether. Because, okay, Heidegger recognizes that this idea of like the they and like inauthentic being, and this kind of idea of like, oh, you perceive yourself as like part of this mass that is just like, oh, one, what one does, like, oh, one does this, I get up every day and go out and whatever, for things of this nature, like, which Heidegger says is a deficient mode or like a deficient expression of being, but also like a necessary one, like, this like, it's there's something bad about it, but it's also kind of just like part of existence or part of Dasein. But I guess like the curious question for me is whether like theyness or whether like everydayness could, for Heidegger or for us, like be arranged differently in a way that greater encourages authentic being. Because like I don't know that much about Heidegger, but I'm pretty sure he's quite critical of modernity, and he kind of idealizes this like pre-modern craftsman sort of like oh, I live in like the village or whatever, and like that's a very that historical mode of being conjures a very different sense of who they is than like if you live in a modern city and you have news media and social media and all
Individuality.
and I guess like this is me, of course, like my indelible like, oh well, obviously I have to read everything like in the light of like revolutionary communism or whatever. I'm like, okay, well, maybe, there is like, I guess I'm almost like raising the question of like the relationship of mode of production, which is of course a Marxist category, and like mode of being, which is a Heideggerian category, and like whether there's a correlation and whether like a change in the mode of production, a progressive change in the mode of production, if you want to use those terms, which I actually don't, but I will, like could bring about a transformation in the way that Dasein expresses itself. Like there's going to be a they no matter what, but maybe like we can arrange life such that authenticity is more possible. Those are my initial points.
That's a great start, Rosemary. Do others want to come in and either add to or maybe take us in another direction?
I see Anton has a hand. Anton, do you want to pick it up from there
Yes,
or
I
you
wanna
have
respond to
something?
Rosemary, but let's get another perspective, Anton.
Yeah, I mean, to continue with this, to go on is maybe another question, because for me, as for Zizek probably, reading Heidegger is a totally different experience, since for Zizek it's really important to emphasize this sort of split in subject, especially in sort of his later work when he's talking about parallax gap, even less than nothing, but it is more about the matter as such. But I find this also very important for Heidegger too, actually, because in this part, he specifically says that the human being is an object. And so for him, it's sort of this duality, after all, for me, because even talking about being and Dasein, that there is something that presupposes existence as such, and therefore through this sort of gap, we have this always appearing of being, not just a simple existence, but all those essences with whom, so to speak, Dasein come up with. And yeah, I find it a really crucial point, so to say, that we have to find this sort of split. So what is they is this split, that there is I, but there is also the second I, which is one could argue is non-I, or just simply I as something that is to be, I, the initial I that asks this question, so to speak. And that's like maybe just adding a little bit to modes of production and stuff like this. This is why, for instance, I think for Heidegger, the question of technology is so important, and this is such a big tragedy, because technology takes the role of an object, and for him this is the tragedy, as far as I'm concerned, that yeah, human being is not an object of philosophy. So yeah, I mean, everything is getting lost. Objectness of subject, one could argue, also objectiveness of subject is getting lost. But of course, that's a whole different question of not this book, of course, but of question of technology, I think it's called, right? But yeah, in any case, this is more of again a Zizek perspective, since I think he himself admitted that he started as Heideggerian, and then he moved on towards dialectics, and now he's more of a Schellingian, which is sort of coming back to where sort of he started from, since of course Schelling is in itself is a huge influence on Heidegger. But I don't know, that's in itself the difference between Schelling, Heidegger, where it lies, where for Schelling it all starts with ground of existence and existence itself, and how it all correlates. But yeah, that's what struck with me, considering Heidegger, that there is this split initially, and this is, one could argue that this is also how Dasein presents being, or how through Dasein the presentness of being itself presents. So yeah, not adding much, but leaning towards more of my thoughts. But yeah, nevertheless, I think it would be nice.
In response to Rosemary, and there's another paragraph I want to bring up, but the French, as you know, through Lacan and many others, Merleau-Ponty on his side, Sartre, you can argue, and then Zizek picks up on Lacan and the return to Schelling, as you said. The Urground, the indifference point, it's not about the finite absolute relationship. It's like the ineffable energy or passion in that ground that draws us into it, but we can't conceptualize it, which later Heidegger picks up on. He does speak to Schelling, then becomes a more important figure in some respects, and even his works on Nietzsche and then the lifelong battle with Hegel. But the splitting of the eye, certainly for the psychoanalysts and then for Zizek. But the Hegelian labor of negation, this problem, I think for a lot of us interested in social change and social praxis and revolution, the theory of revolution, maybe those 20th century figures that had to reckon with Heidegger and maybe bring Heidegger into dialogue with Marx. But, you said mode of production, Rosemary. The labor negation, for when you say the day, the problem with the day is if it's simply subject versus everything else, subject in the world. you and your parents, you and your professors, you and your friends, you and your partner, you and your partners, you and your past, present, future, you know, you and your cat. That's not, the day is already like the problem with the self-consciousness of the master-slave dialectic is already in one of the poles, both in the master, it's in the slave, it's asymmetric. There are two consciousnesses now, self-consciousness competing. There's this problem of movement back and forth between them. You know, which one is going to be the accumulation of spirit from away from alienation towards actualization? We know Hegel drops his card. You go with the slave and the work. But with Heidegger, the day, if it's the problem of the I, being in the world and being inauthentic, falling, as he says, just getting caught up in the everyday moment, forgetting what our true responsibility is or resoluteness to be ourselves, because that death thing is always there. It's non-relational, it's certain, it's indefinite, it can happen any time, it's incomparable, it's unique. The bucket of water with things you can't plug the hole. You can pretend like the bucket doesn't exist and the water's dripping out slowly. You can get caught up in the present. But he also dismisses fear or rushing into death. He also dismisses things like being paralyzed, like, oh, well, I don't know what to do now. The Nazi question comes up in terms of the chapter on historicality, Geschichtlichkeit, and Schicksal, fate, and destiny, because he talks about the collectivity again. Goes back to it. And people will think, oh, he's talking about the Germans, the Nazis. Well, I'm going to introduce that passage in a second. But the day, these are equiprimordial, so they're all mixed up with each other. So let's just break them out. With being, is it with the question of existence and what it means to be? With Dasein as that singular entity that we ourselves can't be replaced with, but it's going to be rooted in some kind of ecstatic temporality just to jump a few steps ahead through, again, going through anxiety. Wanting to be called out from the inauthenticity of the moment to be yourself in this kind of moment of vision. We'll talk about that. Which could bring us back to some Schelling. But the critique that you find in 20th century continental philosophy for the Heidegger crowd, I mean, whoever picks up, Frankfurt School will do its own thing, by the way. Mostly with Hegel, Marx, Weber, Nietzsche, and then Adorno's eventual attempted critique of Heidegger. And the French have like 4 or 5 different paradigms to pick up with Heidegger's influence. But this being oneself is not an isolated subject. It's not being an individual. But it's, if you're deluded, one can say, this is maybe some psychoanalysis, but delusional would be to think that if one is destined to supersede their finite existence by completely embracing it, but inscribing a form of transcendence in it, so you're never like anything else, even in that moment, but you're not narcissistically coming back to just being yourself, like Elon Musk has to truly think he's in a unique position, not just being the richest person in the world, but literally taking over through his arbitrary and unconstitutional coup in a populist frame, speaking about transparency and anti-corruption and defending democracy against bureaucracy, truly accumulating more of himself and not less in the process. So trying to give back to everyone else and free us all. So we don't want that fascistic structure. But we don't want to solipsistically come back to the skeptical point. And this is going to sound terrible, but you don't want to come back to yourself. So who the hell's Raj? And I might have to say, it's not that I don't know. I'm afraid to talk to myself about that question. On throne, which is orphanite, the second I answer it, I may die. You know what do you mean, physically die? Well, you can say existentially die, but I'm very much a kid. You all know. That can get me into trouble. I'm supposed to take some responsibility. I'm supposed to answer the question. I'm supposed to care. Well, I don't give a fuck about anything except justice for the most oppressed. But I don't want to define them too, because I'm not going to define them, Matvey. I know we have to with Kojève and others, and a lot of us do for our social praxis, but I don't want to suck them into the they. Let them be, like liberation theology might teach about the poor. I'm not going to commodify the poor and screw them, which is what everybody's doing in their name. Let me stop there. Matvey, come in, please.
I'll come in with the question by Sumina. And they asked, do beings without memory experience time? Remembering is an energy-intensive process. Simpler organisms do not have memory because they prioritize survival through efficiency, using only the energy needed for immediate response. The more complex the being, the more energy it expands to store, recall, and predict. If all existence is energy in motion, is time simply the cost of memory? And because our physicists claim that energy is never lost, only scattered, could reversing its flow bring back the past, quote unquote past?
Wow, amazing question, Samina. Thank you.
Hello,
Yeah,
can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm here. My question is actually in the chat if you wanna see
Yeah,
it.
I
Okay.
just read
you
it.
just read it.
Yeah, and I also added one more part to the question, but we can continue. Yeah.
Great.
Feel free
fantastic.
to, yeah.
Okay, I would like to take that question on rather than deconstruct it. I'm gonna bring it back to section here that I gotta find real quick. But as I get started in the interpretation, this is division. Yeah, I mean, you know, this question of reversal and memory, all of Heidegger's obsessions with Nietzsche in the 1936 lectures and way beyond that, what is called thinking. He always goes back to Nietzsche and he says, okay, well, Nietzsche is the one that taught us as the first genealogist, the first transvaluator of all values, the first to put into question the value of values and the will to truth, and therefore the will to nothingness, which is what Western man ended up becoming, totally nihilistic because they'd rather will nothing than not will, to conclude the genealogy. But the Nietzsche's problem is that the past we're always dragging along. We're a brute animal that was beaten to submission through debt and discipline and all these different powers and knowledge that Foucault will pick up on to make us feel guilty. So we got to get beyond this good and evil. Why are you always dragging your past? Go, just, can you unhitch it for me? I don't want this. I'd rather just be nothing, pure nothing. If you want about will to nothing, then don't have any trace or remainder of a past. But it clings to us, and something happened, some freak accident happened in human consciousness. Another strange person that you might want to consider, and Derrida actually quotes him about gravitology. I know we have some scholars of Derrida here. Andre Leroy Gourhan, Leroy Gourhan, paleontologist, so physical anthropologist, prehistoric, so not ancient anthropology, right? Physical anthropology, maybe paleo. Weird dude. I think the English translation of the life works. And he may not be as famous as any of these other famous French people, like your Kojak, or Levi-Strauss, or Bentham, or Derrida, or Foucault, sitting on all these famous Germans. But I think speech and gesture. Now, the hypothesis there, which is going to be very important when we get to speech and writing, is, do you want to believe in that epochal leap to the hominoid, the Homo sapien, from the ape, as what we modern humans would then anachronistically maybe impose upon those caves, the first representations? You know, Durkheim has something to say about this as well. So, you know, Maus and Levi-Strauss for sure. But he really, is it about evolution of the hand so that writing is a form of speech, but visualized in whatever form of representation? That could be the early cave kind of inscriptions. Was it about hunting and animals for the early civilizations? Or is it, do we have it backwards? If that is not what it is, then memory is not the cause based on past actions for the hominoid, meaning the human being that's advanced. So he's like a little deconstructionist or proto-deconstructionist, advanced over the animal, because in order to write, you should remember. You know, you don't write the past into the future. Not fiction, imagination, you can anticipate. But anticipation still has to draw from that drag of the past. And so what's even bizarre is that maybe something like memory is an illusion, that writing has to therefore constantly delude us about, and we're actually not remembering anything. And therefore, any attempt to signify those inscriptions, which we think are those early hominoids, is not what we think they are. So what the hell could they be? then he, of course, he brings us back to the evolutionary biology of it, is that the erection up from the ground, 40 Homo erectus, so we're on all fours and like animals, it's only when we get that distance and stand up and start walking, that distance of which we think is the brain and memory and evolution, and telling us that the hand as an extension to the pen to write. See what I'm getting at here? Is that if you think this is all part of evolution and civilization, why don't we go backwards? And I'm not saying that that was your point, Samina, or question, but it throws into doubt everything we might think of as the human being. He's a weird dude. Derrida is smart enough to pick up on this, and he uses it for his own complex formulation. When we get to Derrida, there's not even a Dasein to talk about. He's going to be critical of all this Heidegger stuff, which creates a little bit of separation, a lot of debates about whether he, in fact, draws a lot from him, does anything different, should be a person we don't even think about because he's just, nobody understands what the hell he's talking about. He's a waste of time, many people might say. We're going to take the time, but we're going to have to figure out how he might be separate from all this. But what I have to come back to is that they, if we can leave it at that, the ecstasis of the Dasein being thrown out. I can just find it real quick. I'll leave you with this quote. Maybe we'll use that as our transition. It's Division 2, Chapter 5, which is that fateful chapter where the Nazi question comes back, because the collective returns for Heidegger, and everybody wants to situate that with the destiny of the Germans leading to Nazi. 75 is the quote, because the term fate comes up. Accepting the fate, handing yourself down, something that should be repeated, but doing it in a new way. Not the word historical. Very famous thing. You really need the German, but only an entity which in its being is essentially futural, so that it's free for its death and can let itself be thrown back upon its factical there by shattering itself against death. This is not a near-death experience. It's not Jesus by himself, the only person who ever did that, conquered death and truly was resurrected and was truly dead, didn't go into a coma. It's not those two. So no near-death experiences after life. What the heck, what's the death factor? You're shattering itself against future. Like, I'm constantly paranoid about being stuck in the present. Why do I always talk about despising my own generation? Am I being disingenuous? Am I playing you all by pretending to be Gen Z valued? Or am I doing something? Am I really going into my future? What am I doing? You should call me out and say, look, I don't believe you, that you're trying to pass. It's very dangerous with it. And then this is how things get manipulated, which is exactly what the government they're doing to the young, at least those that voted. So what is this? What's this game we're playing here? But future meaning, I don't mean like I got to get to my future of me right now. I have to always stand out ecstatically, ecstasis outside of itself. I can't be here. It's suffocating. Remember this question of life, breathing, suffocating, death is breathing. An entity which, as future, is equiprimordial in the process of having been. And in those earlier sections on temporality, the process of having been historizes out of the future. You might say, my past is coming out of my future. Not my recollection at my funeral, like on my tombstone, I wanted to say this and that. Or I wrote a famous philosophy book and everyone thinks I'm a genius or something. No, none of those things. That's all memory of somebody else and even myself. That's all inauthentic. Process, I mean, handing down to itself the possibility that it's inherited. What's this inheritance? Was I chosen? Was it sent to me? Heidegger, was it sent to you? Nietzsche's fate or destiny, the Superman? Hitler was chosen? You, Heidegger, were chosen? What? Be in the moment of vision for its time. A transvaluation of everything. The overcoming. The Sonderweg, you know. Only authentic temporality, which at the same time is fun, that makes possible fundamental fate. That is to say, authentic historicality. That's not history. It's not historicity, the quality of being historical. Fate is not like, oh, damn, those Greek fates, like my friend talks about. Oh, those ancient Greeks, they were so naive, they were little kids, so infantile, that the fate struck them. They have gods that represent the mysteries of the faith. Now, if those that condemn Heidegger say this is all just Those that want to defend him will say you cannot reduce it to that moment, 1927, 1933 and beyond. But this is just you, I'll bring it back to you, like I did with Hegel. You cannot subscribe to anything you find remotely inauthentic about your age. And guess what? You're just being bombarded by it. I hate to say it. Universities may not be helping. Their parents may not be helping. The government's not helping. Who's going to help you? Well, you got to help yourself. You don't have them. Stop there. 2 more remarks, and then I have to race to my class.
Yeah, like a very tiny remark. We've talked last semester about this essay by Walter Benjamin on the concept of history, famous essay.
Oh.
And it really kind of, this resemblance, at least for me, maybe on a political level, different with, you know, Benjamin.
That would be a great
And-
comparison, contrast.
But still, this idea of exploding the continuum of history, right? The idea of trying to kind of, you know, escape the time that was like, you know, shoot the clock, right? Shoot the
Theses on the philosophy of history?
Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
Menards.
Angelic.
exactly. So I wonder.
Why don't we read him in addition to Derrida next week?
We-
Bring that, just
we-
that.
We
much.
did, but we should we should read it too. But I was just thinking that this idea, and especially by this notion of futural, right? I guess for me before, I just sensed that there Heidegger would, you know, kind of with his conservative kind of point of view would take that the idea of das Man cannot be escaped. Benjamin is trying to escape it. He's saying that we have to escape it to this messianic time, and you know, but at the same time, I don't think it's that easy. It's that straightforward, as
It's
you
his own
say.
critique and also
Yeah.
question of redemption from modernity's nihilism. It's
Exactly.
taken from everyone too. He's also a contemporary of Heidegger. But the question of the instant,
Yeah.
undoing that commodity fetish.
Yeah.
We can get it. What is that? What is his space of authenticity? Maybe we'll bring it, but when we get to Derrida, the opening moments of grammatology, he's also going to introduce this problem of history. So that's why I want to end with this quote. We'll go to him. That way he'll tell us about what we're going to read for Derrida as well.
Okay.
And we'll set that up. And these days they're publishing through the University of Chicago, I believe, the unpublished lectures of the 60s, including a lecture in 65 on Hegel and Heidegger, philosophy of history. So we won't have time to get into that. We're going to do his quote unquote most quote unquote famous work, and like his quote unquote being in time, which is of grammatology, 1967. Rosemary, did you want to come in?
Oh, I was just using about Heidegger's Nazism, which I thought it was interesting that in the bit where Heidegger's talking about the they, he talks about like how he does this whole spiel about how like, oh, you know, no one is responsible for anything because, you know, responsibility is sort of disburdened by the they, which sounds a lot like, well, I know that Arendt like dated Heidegger, but you know, when she's talking about Eichmann and all that, you know, this idea that's become very common in the understanding of the way that the Nazi regime functioned was like everyone was a functionary, everyone was a bureaucrat, so people could do these, you know, could you know, do the bookkeeping for sending people to death camps, but you know, the idea was like to me, it seems like Nazi society is the absolute culmination of like the inauthenticity of the they. But of course, Heidegger wouldn't have seen it that way. So
He wouldn't have at the time, and also the jury's out in terms of the verdict of even later, but certainly all the critics that come later. I will leave with this, the they is not anyone else. This is a personal testimony. If the they is yourself, then that's the problem, and that's what you're trying to run from. But what are you running from if it doesn't exist as you and your past? Is it something archaic? Is it that Leroy Gourhan? What are we as the proto-human herd? Or the invention of the new proletariat? Okay. Thank you all. We're
Thank
gonna
you all.
Stop recording.
Thank you.